The last thing my daughter said before slamming the car door was, "This is what you deserve, Mom." 3 days later, that same daughter called me 45 times. And by the time I finally picked up, it was already too late. My name is Evelyn May Corbin, 74 years old, retired seamstress and widow of a man who once believed the world could be mended with patience and a steady hand. I used to believe that too. Standing in front of the old cabin that day, suitcase in one hand and the other clutching the railing eaten by rot, I wondered when exactly that belief had gone sour. The cabin sat on the slope of a wooded hill outside Asheville, North Carolina, half swallowed by the forest. Its roof sagged like an exhausted back. Ivy climbed through the cracks of the porch. Claire had parked the car on the gravel road trunk, still open, her perfume clashing with the smell of pine and damp wood. I waited for her to say something softer, something that might explain the coldness in her eyes. But she only shoved my suitcase toward me, got behind the wheel, and drove off without looking back. The sound of her tires faded until the forest reclaimed the silence. I stood there longer than I should have, watching the dust settle, expecting maybe she'd realize what she'd done. The air was heavy, still carrying a hint of summer humidity, though the light had that brittle quality that comes just before fall. My knees trembled as I climbed the 2 steps to the porch. Inside, the air was thick with mildew. Light filtered through broken shutters, striping the floor with pale gold. There was a single chair, a narrow cot pushed against the wall, and a stove so rusted it looked more decorative than useful. I placed my suitcase on the floor, brushed my palms together, and tried to steady my breathing. Claire said she'd fixed up a place where you can rest. I almost laughed at the memory how easily I had wanted to believe that lie. A mouse darted from under the stove and I flinched. "It's just you and me," I whispered to the empty room. My voice sounded unfamiliar, smaller. I found an old broom leaning in a corner and began to sweep, not because it helped, but because it gave me something to do. Dust rose in gray waves, catching in my throat. After an hour, the floorboards appeared again, revealing scars from years of neglect. When my hands started shaking, I stopped, sat on the cot, and listened. Outside, the forest shifted and murmured. Cicadas buzzed low and steady, and somewhere distant, water trickled over stone. That sound drew me to the back of the cabin, where I found a rusted pump and a metal basin. I pressed the handle down. The pipe groaned, coughed, and finally spat out a stream of cold, clear water. I cupped it in my palms, tasted iron and earth. It was strange how quickly instinct returned. I gathered fallen branches, found a half-burned candle in my suitcase, and managed to light it. The flame flickered, painting the walls with moving shadows. For the first time in years, I felt the small, stubborn pulse of self-reliance I used to know. Night fell fast in the woods. Through the cracks in the shutters, the sky turned indigo, then black. The wind whistled against the boards, finding every gap in the wood. I wrapped myself in the thin quilt Claire had packed one she hadn't washed, and lay back staring at the ceiling beams. The smell of pine sap and damp earth filled the air. I tried not to think about the look on her face as she drove away the mixture of irritation and triumph, as if she'd finally won something. Maybe she thought she was done with me. Maybe she believed the silence of these woods would swallow me whole. But silence doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it waits patient as soil for something to grow. Outside, the night hummed quietly, and I listened until the sound became almost gentle. Tomorrow I would see where that road led, and whether this place was meant to bury me or teach me how to live again. When I woke that morning, the smell of damp wood had settled into my hair. I boiled a little water on the rusted stove, drank it plain, and sat by the window as pale light crept through the trees. The quiet of that house pressed close, and before I knew it, my thoughts had wandered back to another morning long ago, when my home still smelled of starch and cotton thread instead of mildew. Back then, our small farmhouse sat on the edge of Asheville, painted butter yellow with white shutters Paul had built himself. The sewing room was mine alone, though it never stayed quiet for long. The hum of my singer machine filled the walls, the needle rising and falling in rhythm with my breath. There were scraps of fabric everywhere, polka dots, florals, leftover lace from wedding gowns. The floor carried a soft snow of thread. Paul used to lean on the doorway in the evening's arms, crossed, smiling that tired smile of his. "You could turn rags into miracles, Eve," he'd say. I'd laugh, wipe sweat from my forehead, and keep stitching. That was how I measured time in seams, in hems, in the whisper of fabric pulled taut under my fingers. Every dress I finished meant groceries on the table, notebooks for the kids. The light bill paid one more month. Claire and Jonah grew up within that rhythm. Jonah, my youngest, would sit under the table collecting buttons I dropped, calling them treasures. Claire helped at first, sorting fabric, threading needles, but she grew impatient quickly. She was born with sharper edges than I ever had. By the time she entered high school, her world had shifted to one of polished shoes and polished words. I remember the afternoon she came home from a friend's house, her first sleepover in the city. She stood at the door, looking around the living room, as if seeing it for the first time, the quilted couch, the jars of buttons on the shelf, the faint hum of my sewing machine. "Mom," she said, wrinkling her nose, "my friends' moms don't work from home like this. They have offices." I laughed, not understanding yet. "This is my office, honey, and it's kept you in shoes and books since you could walk." But her eyes darted away, embarrassed, and something inside me folded a little. After that, she stopped inviting friends over. When I picked her up from school, she would step away from my car before her classmates saw me. Once, I overheard her tell someone I did alterations for extra cash, as if it were a hobby, not a life. I tried not to let it hurt. Paul said it was a phase, that she'd outgrow her hunger for appearances. He'd place his hand over mine at dinner, steady and warm. "You did good, Evelyn. She just doesn't see it yet." He was always the calm to my ache. Even when the machine broke down or the bills piled higher than the fabric, he believed in the simple dignity of our lives. "We've got what matters," he'd whisper at night, his hand finding mine in the dark. And for years, I believed him completely. Now, sitting in that decaying cabin, I could still hear the faint hum of the old sewing machine in my memory, steady, patient, alive. That sound had built a home once. It had built a daughter too, though somewhere along the way, she decided she was too good to wear the fabric that made her. In those years after the children grew and went off to build their own lives, my sewing kept the rhythm of our days. I didn't have wealth or titles, but my name was known in half of Asheville. Brides came to me with lace that belonged to their mothers, girls with eyes full of prom night dreams, and church ladies needing curtains to match the new hymn books. Payment often came in envelopes of mixed bills and coins, sometimes a basket of peaches, sometimes a jar of honey. I never turned anyone away. Work was work, and gratitude was a kind of currency, too. On Saturdays, Paul would drive me into town to deliver finished garments. He'd load them carefully into the back seat, treating each box as if it were glass. While I collected deposits or pinned hems in the community hall, he'd sit near the window, reading the paper, whistling softly. We never said it aloud, but those little drives were our date's quiet time that belonged only to us. At home, I kept ledgers in a marbled notebook, pencil marks faded from years of use. Every stitch was accounted for. When the bills came, I'd set aside what was needed and tuck a few dollars into a coffee tin above the stove. Paul used to joke that my hands had paid for more than any banker's signature ever could. "You build things, Eve," he'd say. I'd just keep the nails straight. Then one winter, he began to tire easily. At first, we blamed the cold. He'd come home from the hardware store, rub his side, and shrug it off. By spring, his appetite had vanished, and I knew something was wrong. The diagnosis came quietly in a beige room that smelled of antiseptic pancreatic cancer advanced. I remember the doctor's lips moving the shapes of words like months, palliative, and quality of life. The only sound that stayed with me was the ticking of the wall clock. From that day, time lost its steady rhythm. The sewing machine went silent for a while. I spent my mornings managing medications, blending soup-counting pills in the dim kitchen light. The smell of starch was replaced by the sharp scent of disinfectant. Paul tried to smile through it, but the color left his cheeks, replaced by a gray I had never seen on him. He'd whisper, "Don't you stop working, Eve. It keeps you steady." So I moved the machine into the bedroom right next to his chair and sewed between doses of pain medicine. The neighbors helped when they could. The church took up a small collection. Claire started visiting more often, then always with that brisk tone she'd learned from her office job in Charlotte. "Mom, you shouldn't have to worry about bills," she'd say, clicking through my papers with a practiced hand. "Let me handle the paperwork. You focus on Dad." At first, I was grateful. She seemed organized, confident. She brought binders labeled envelopes and a small laptop that looked far too elegant for our worn table. She paid some hospital invoices online, explaining how convenient digital banking was. I watched her fingers move fast, assured, and thought maybe she'd finally grown into the kind of woman her father would be proud of. When Paul's pain worsened, she managed the hospice arrangements too. "You shouldn't lift a finger," she told me, and I believed her. I wanted to believe her. The night before he passed, I sat beside him with a half-finished dress on my lap. The candle flickered low, catching the silver of his hair. "Promise me you'll rest after this," he murmured. "Promise me you'll let someone take care of you for once." I nodded, brushing his hand with mine. I didn't know that promise would lead me straight into the kind of care that takes more than it gives. When the undertakers came the next morning, the sewing machine was still humming. It was the only sound I could make that didn't feel like breaking. The morning of Paul's funeral began with rain that never once stopped. It wasn't a downpour, just a slow, steady drizzle that clung to everything: the trees, the grass, the edges of my coat. The churchyard was full of black umbrellas, each one bowed against the wind like a field of dark flowers. I remember gripping mine too tightly, afraid that if I let go of something, anything, I might come apart completely. The pastor's voice blurred behind the hiss of rain. He spoke kindly of Paul, his quiet strength, his laugh, his devotion to family. I wanted to look up to thank him for remembering the man beneath the illness, but my eyes stayed fixed on the wooden casket that seemed smaller than it should have been. The wet earth around it was the color of coffee grounds, and I kept thinking how Paul would have hated that mud on his shoes, mud on his tools. Claire stood beside me, her arm looped through mine. Every few minutes she'd whisper, "It's okay, Mom. I've got you." I let her hold me, let her guide me from one place to another, because I couldn't trust my own balance. Jonah had flown in from Oregon the night before, his face pale with exhaustion. He stood on the other side of the grave, hands clasped, tears streaking down his cheeks. When the pastor finally said, "Rest now, brother," Jonah stepped forward, dropped a single white rose on the casket, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he turned away, shoulders shaking. After the burial, the crowd filtered toward the church hall for sandwiches and weak coffee. People spoke softly, touching my shoulder, repeating the same kind words I barely absorbed. "He was a good man. You were lucky to have him." I nodded, smiled when I could, and tried to breathe through the fog that filled my chest. Claire handled everything: the flowers, the condolences, the bills. She moved like someone trained for crisis, efficient and composed. "You don't need to worry about any of this," she told me, sliding papers into her leather folder. "I'll take care of it. You should just rest." When Jonah hugged me goodbye that night, he promised to visit soon. "Once things settle down at work," he said. I believed him. He had always been the one who called on holidays, who remembered birthdays even after he moved across the country. But after he left for the airport, the house felt unbearably large. Every sound echoed the ticking clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the wind pressing against the windows. Claire stayed the night in the guest room. In the morning, I found her already dressed, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. Her hair was tied up neatly, her face calm. "Mom," she said, sliding 1 cup toward me. "You can't stay here alone anymore. It's not safe. You're too isolated out here, and I don't want you driving in these roads. Come stay with me, just until we figure things out." I stared at her, too tired to argue. The rain was still coming down outside, soft and endless. "All right," I said quietly. She smiled, relieved. "Good. I'll need some of your papers to get everything organized, insurance, pension, the deed. I'll make sure it's all squared away." She gathered the envelopes from the kitchen drawer, the ones Paul had kept labeled in his careful handwriting. I didn't protest. I just sat there watching her tuck them into her folder, the sound of rain steady against the glass. When she closed the door behind her to make a few calls, I let my fingers rest on the empty spot where the papers had been. The wood was cool beneath my hand, smooth from years of being touched. For a moment, I thought I felt the faintest vibration there, like the hum of my old sewing machine, trying to remind me that some things shouldn't be handed over so easily. Claire's apartment was nothing like the house I'd left behind. It sat on the 7th floor of a glass building that overlooked the city. Everything sleek, spotless, and strangely quiet. The air smelled faintly of citrus and something metallic, the kind of scent that came from machines rather than people. When I stepped inside, I almost hesitated to breathe, afraid I'd leave fingerprints on the polished walls. Claire's husband, David, greeted me at the door. He was tall, careful with his words, the sort of man who smiled with only half his mouth. "Welcome, Mrs. Corbin," he said, taking my suitcase before I could protest. "We've set up the guest room for you. You'll be comfortable here." His politeness felt rehearsed, like a script he'd learned for an audience that wasn't me. Still, I thanked him and followed the click of his shoes down the hallway. The guest room was immaculate white bedding. Beige curtains, not a single photograph on the dresser. It didn't smell lived in. Claire appeared behind me, her hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "You can relax now," she said. "No more worrying about bills or doctors or any of that. You're with us." I nodded, too tired to answer. From the living room came the muffled sound of cartoons. My grandchildren, Ella 6 and Ryan 9, ran toward me, their laughter bright as the morning light. They wrapped their arms around my legs, nearly knocking me off balance. I hadn't realized how much I needed that touch until it happened. "Grandma, look!" Ella held up a picture she'd drawn, a stick figure family holding hands beneath a rainbow. "That's you," she said, pointing at the smallest one. My throat tightened. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," I whispered. For a few minutes, everything felt normal again, warm, full alive. But it didn't last. Claire appeared in the doorway, her voice clipped. "Kids, Grandma's had a long trip. She needs to rest." They hesitated, glancing up at me, but she was already herding them away. The sound of their footsteps faded down the hall, leaving only the quiet hum of the refrigerator. That night, we had dinner at the long glass table. The food was delicate and arranged like art salmon wild rice greens I couldn't name. I reached for the serving spoon, but Claire was quicker. "I've got it, Mom," she said. "You just sit." David asked about the drive, about the house, about my plans, though it was clear he already knew the answers. I spoke softly, careful not to make the air heavier than it already was. Afterward, I offered to wash the dishes, but Claire shook her head. "We have a service that picks them up. Just leave them." She smiled in a way that wasn't quite a smile. "You don't have to do anything anymore." The next morning, I found a letter in the mail, addressed to me, an insurance statement. Before I could open it, Claire took it from my hands. "Don't worry about that," she said lightly. "I'll file it with the others." She slid it into a drawer I'd never seen open. Days passed like that, each one quieter than the last. I tried to make myself useful. folded towels, watered plants. But Claire always intervened. "Mom, please. You'll strain yourself." Even my sewing kit, the little tin I'd carried everywhere for 50 years, disappeared from my nightstand. When I asked, she said, "You don't need that anymore. You're retired." At night, the city glowed outside my window, 1,000 lights that didn't belong to me. The hum of traffic rose and fell like waves, but inside the apartment, there was only stillness. I lay awake listening for the small sounds that made a home. Footsteps, laughter, the murmur of a familiar voice. But the silence never broke. It was strange, I thought, how you could live surrounded by people and still feel like a ghost. It started with a form. Claire said it was just to make things easier. "It's called a power of attorney, Mom," she explained one morning over coffee, her voice calm, professional. "You'll still be in charge of everything. This just lets me sign things on your behalf in case something happens. It's safer that way." She laid the papers on the glass table between us, each page thick and stamped with blue ink. I hesitated, tracing my finger over my own name, Evelyn. May Corbin, printed in sharp black letters. It looked official, permanent, as though the paper already knew more about me than I did. "I don't want to trouble you," I said. "You're not," she replied quickly. "You raised me, remember? Let me take care of you now." Her eyes softened when she said it, and I wanted to believe that warmth was real. David stood nearby reading something on his phone. "Claire's good with these things," he added without looking up. "You'll be better off with her handling it." So I signed. The pen felt heavy in my hand. Claire smiled, gathered the pages neatly, and kissed my cheek. "You'll thank me later, Mom." For a while, nothing changed. She bought me new clothes, took me to the salon, opened an account for my personal expenses. I thought maybe she was right. Maybe this was how kindness looked now, wrapped in efficiency and digital passwords. But then, little things began to vanish. The pension check that arrived every month stopped coming. When I asked, Claire said it was deposited automatically. "Less hassle," she said. "You don't have to worry about paperwork anymore." I tried to believe her. But weeks later, when I asked to send a small donation to the church Paul and I had attended, she hesitated. "I'll handle it," she said, then changed the subject. The first time I truly felt something was wrong was the day I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from the county office, a notice confirming the sale of the farmhouse. My heart stumbled as I read the words twice, then a third time. The farmhouse, our home, the one Paul built, the one buried under my memories, had been sold. I confronted Claire that evening while she was setting the dinner table. "What does this mean?" I asked, holding out the letter. She didn't even look at it. "It means I sold the property, Mom. Maintaining it was too expensive. And you said yourself you didn't want to live there anymore. I never said you could sell it." She sighed as though explaining something to a child. "Technically you did when you signed the papers. It was in your best interest." My voice shook. "That house was your father's." "And he's gone," she snapped before softening her tone again. "Mom, I know it's hard, but we have to be practical. You're comfortable here. The money's invested. You'll never have to worry again." I turned to David, who had been standing quietly by the counter. "You knew about this." He lowered his eyes. "Claire's doing what's best for everyone, Mrs. Corbin. The upkeep was too much. You don't need the stress." The words hit me harder than any shout could have. I sat down, my hands trembling, the room spinning slightly. After dinner, I went to my room and searched the drawers where I'd kept my documents. They were gone. Every envelope, every certificate, every record of my life neatly removed. All that remained was the faint smell of the lavender sachet I'd tucked among them. I closed the drawer slowly, the sound echoing through the quiet apartment. Through the window, the city glimmered cold, indifferent, alive, in a way I no longer was. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't dared to think before my name was still mine on paper, but in every way that mattered, it already belonged to her. It was a Thursday morning when Claire came into my room, her phone in one hand and car keys in the other. Her voice was bright in a way that immediately made me uneasy. "Mom, I found something perfect for you," she said. "A peaceful cottage outside the city. You'll love it, quiet, fresh air birds. You've been cooped up too long." Before I could answer, she was already opening my closet, folding my clothes into a suitcase. The efficiency in her movements left no space for discussion. "You'll feel better there," she added. "Less noise, less stress. You need peace." I sat on the edge of the bed, watching her hands move through my life like they owned it. "Is David coming too?" I asked. She didn't look up. "No, Mom, he's busy with work. But I'll take you myself. It's only a short drive." By the time we reached the elevator, she had my coat over her arm, my purse slung across her shoulder, and the suitcase rolling behind her. I felt like a guest in my own existence. The drive began under a bright, cloudless sky. Claire talked the whole way about property taxes, investment returns, how she'd handled my remaining accounts. Her words ran together like static, and I nodded at intervals, staring out the window as the city dissolved behind us. Glass towers gave way to suburbs, suburbs to hills, hills to forest. The road curved and narrowed, climbing into the mountains where cell service dropped, and the air turned cool and sharp. "Almost there," she said. We drove in silence for the last half hour. The GPS voice faded, leaving only the hum of tires against gravel. The forest pressed close, trees crowding the roadside. I caught glimpses of old barns and weathered fences half swallowed by ivy. Somewhere deep in the valley, a river glittered through the trees like a blade. When the car finally stopped, I blinked at the sight before me. The cottage was small and crooked, its paint peeled to gray, the porch half collapsed. A single shutter dangled loose beside a window. The place looked less like a retreat and more like something time had forgotten. Claire turned off the engine, her face unreadable. "It's only temporary," she said, "until I sort a few things out. You'll be fine here." I opened my mouth, but the words stuck. She got out, opened the trunk, and set my suitcase on the ground. "There's food inside. Canned stuff mostly. The power works. Oh, and don't call me for a while, okay? I need space to deal with the banks." Her tone was final, businesslike, the same voice she used with contractors on the phone. She gave me a brief hug, arms stiff, eyes elsewhere, and walked back to the car. The door slammed. The engine started. I stood on the dirt path, the suitcase handle cold against my palm. Dust rose behind the tires as the car rolled away, shrinking between the trees until it disappeared completely. The sound of the engine lingered for a moment, then faded, swallowed by the wind. The forest was utterly still. No city hum, no children laughing, no footsteps in the hall. Just the low creak of branches and the pulse of my own heartbeat. I turned toward the house and reached for the rusted doorknob, the metal cool and foreign in my hand. It turned easily. The door opened with a groan, and the scent of damp air drifted out to meet me. The first night in that house felt like a punishment carved out of silence. The walls groaned with every breath of wind, and the roof leaked in slow, rhythmic drips that marked time better than any clock. I found a dusty blanket in the corner and spread it over the thin mattress, trying not to think about what might have lived there before me. The cupboard held a few canned beans, soup, peaches in syrup, and a single dented pot. Claire had been right about one thing. There was food just enough to keep a body alive, not enough to feel human. I opened a can of beans, cold and heavy in my hand, and ate straight from it while sitting by the window. The light outside was fading, and the trees swayed like black ghosts against the sky. The air smelled of damp wood and rust. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something move outside, a low shuffle near the porch, claws on old boards. Once, a shadow darted past the window, followed by a soft, chittering sound. Raccoons, I told myself. Just raccoons. But the thought didn't stop my heart from pounding. When the rain began, it came without warning, hard and cold. Water spilled through a hole in the ceiling, splattering onto the floor beside the mattress. I pushed a bucket under it, though the sound of each drop only made the house feel emptier. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. I thought about the farmhouse, Paul's hands repairing the fence, the smell of bread cooling on the counter, the warmth that had once meant safety. Now even my memories felt confiscated, as if Claire had taken those too when she drove away. At some point near dawn, I gave up on rest. The rain had stopped, and the silence outside was almost pure. I stepped onto the back porch, my shoes sinking slightly into the mud. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of wet earth. That's when I saw it, half hidden, behind a patch of weeds, an old hand pump, leaning crookedly beside a stone trough. I brushed the rust from the handle and pulled. It groaned once, then water burst forth clear, cold, alive. I cupped my hands and drank. It tasted like stone and rain, like something untouched by anyone's deceit. As I stood there, the first light of morning breaking through the trees, something shifted inside me. The fear that had followed me from the city loosened its grip, leaving a hollow space where something else, something stronger, was beginning to form. The morning after I found the pump, I filled 2 jars with the cold water and decided to follow the narrow dirt road that curved down the mountain. I didn't know where it led, only that sitting still in that house would drive me mad. My legs ached with each step, but the air was clean and sharp, and the sound of my own breath kept me company. After nearly 2 hours of walking, the forest began to thin, and a faded wooden sign appeared by the roadside, Brevard 2 miles. The name stirred something in me, half memory, half hope. I tightened my scarf and kept going until the trees opened into a small town that looked like it had stepped out of another decade. A single main street ran through it, lined with old brick storefronts and painted benches. The first door I pushed open belonged to a narrow grocery called Patel's Market. A bell above the frame jingled, and the smell of cardamom and fresh bread filled the air. Behind the counter stood a woman with dark, silver-streaked hair tied in a braid. She looked up from her ledger and smiled. "Good morning, dear. You must be new around here." I nodded, suddenly aware of how out of place I looked. Mud on my shoes, coat still damp from the night's rain. "Just staying a little while outside town," I said softly. "Well, you found the right place. I'm Mrs. Patel. My husband passed a few years back, so it's just me and the store now. You look like you could use a cup of tea." Before I could refuse, she was already pouring from a thermos. The tea was sweet and spiced warmth, spreading through me in a way I hadn't felt in months. She asked no questions, only listened as I mentioned the cottage, the distance, the quiet. When I finished, she patted my hand gently. "There's a market day every Thursday," she said. "You come down when you can. I always need help sorting crates or labeling jars. Won't pay much, but it'll keep you busy." I thanked her, blinking against the sudden sting in my eyes. It had been a long time since anyone offered me something without strings. On my way out, I nearly collided with an older man pushing open the door. He wore a wool cap and carried a folder under one arm. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, then looked closer. "You're staying up by the ridge, aren't you? That old carpenter property, I suppose so," I replied. He smiled faintly. "Name's Ed Owens. Used to do land surveys around here before my knees gave up. That place has good bones, even if it's half falling apart. There's a spring behind it, pure water, the kind you don't find anymore." I told him I'd found it the day before, and his eyes lit up. "Then you're lucky. Folks used to say that spring never runs dry, even in drought. Take care of it, and it'll take care of you." We talked for a while on the porch about weather, about the town's quiet rhythm, about how people here looked out for one another. Before leaving, he scribbled his number on a torn page. "If you need tools or a ride, just call. My truck's old, but it still climbs hills." By the time I started the walk back up the mountain, the afternoon sun had turned the road gold. My legs were heavy, but something lighter moved inside me, a feeling I couldn't name. Maybe it was trust, or maybe it was just the first spark of belonging. When I reached the cottage, the trees no longer felt like walls. They felt like witnesses keeping quiet watch while I began quietly to reclaim my own life. A week after my visit to town, the mountain had started to feel less like exile and more like a test I could pass if I kept moving. Each morning, I swept the porch, fetched water from the pump, and walked a little farther down the trail, just to remind myself I could. One afternoon, as I was pulling weeds near the steps, I heard the slow crunch of tires on gravel. When I turned, I saw Mr. Owens's rusted pickup rolling toward the house, a folded map spread across the passenger seat beside him. He waved through the window, his grin wide beneath the brim of his cap. "Afternoon, Mrs. Corbin," he called. "Hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was going through some old county maps and thought you'd want to see something." He climbed out with effort, carrying the map and a thick folder. We sat at the small wooden table near the door, the sunlight slicing through the trees in long, quiet lines. He spread the papers flat, the edges yellowed and soft from years of handling. "This here's the Carpenter parcel, your place now," he said, tapping the map with a gnarled finger. "But look closer. See this faint line running through it?" I leaned over, squinting. There was a thin, almost invisible boundary cutting across the land. "That's the old survey from before the county merger," he continued. "Turns out half of this property was once part of another lot, registered under Paul Corbin, your late husband." My breath caught. "Paul?" He nodded. "I checked the records in town this morning. After he passed, your daughter must have filed for transfer, but never finished it. Maybe a clerical error, maybe on purpose. Either way, the deed's in limbo. The part where this house sits, technically, still belongs to his estate." I stared at the map, as if it might explain something my heart already knew. "So what does that mean?" Owens rubbed his chin. "It means no one, not even your daughter, can legally claim this spot without probate or a new filing. And since the estate was never settled, you're still the next of kin with standing rights." He looked up, eyes steady. "In plain English, Mrs. Corbin, you might just own this place without anyone realizing it." The air felt thicker, suddenly charged with something that wasn't quite hope yet, but close. For months, I'd lived like a trespasser in my own life. Now, here on this crooked patch of land, the past had left a door half open. Owens folded the map carefully. "If you want, I can help you draw up a claim of occupancy. Won't be quick, but it's solid ground to stand on. And this time, make sure your name's the one on the line." I traced the faint border again, following its curve, as it wrapped around the small, square, marked dwelling. Paul's handwriting came back to me the way he used to label every shelf, every jar in the workshop. He'd always believed in order and doing things right. Somewhere, he must have left one piece unfinished. "Maybe he wanted me to find it," I said quietly. Owens smiled. "Then maybe it's time you take it back." When he drove away, I stayed at the table, the map spread open under my hands. The paper smelled of dust and oil, but beneath that, I could almost feel the pulse of something alive, like the land itself was remembering who it truly belonged to. The following week, Mr. Owens drove me back down the mountain to meet a woman he said I could trust. The sign outside the small office read, "Rivera and Finch, Legal Services, the paint still new." Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fresh paper. Behind a desk, stacked with folders, sat a young woman with dark curls pulled into a low bun, glasses slipping down her nose. "You must be Mrs. Corbin," she said, standing to shake my hand. "I'm Maria Rivera. Ed told me a little about your situation. Please sit." Her voice was calm, but carried an energy that reminded me of the daughter I once hoped Claire would become, capable, warm, and unafraid. She opened a folder revealing the property map Owens had brought and several photocopies of county records. So she began, part of the parcel remains under your late husband's name, and no probate was ever finalized. That gives us a foundation to contest any unauthorized sale or transfer. I nodded slowly. Claire sold everything. My pension, our house, she said it was for my safety. Rivera's expression didn't change, but her pen stopped moving. Did you sign a power of attorney? Yes. She sighed softly, not in pity, but recognition. You're not alone. These cases are, unfortunately, common. She turned the folder toward me, pointing to a page of legal phrases that meant little to my eyes. We'll start with an injunction, something that prevents further transactions until we sort the ownership. Then we file what's called a quiet title claim. It's a way to legally declare this property yours based on continuous occupancy and rightful inheritance. Will that stop her? It'll make her think twice, Rivera said. But it'll take months, maybe longer. These things move at their own pace. I looked down at my hands, still rough from years of sewing. I've waited my whole life for things to be fair, I said. A few more months won't kill me. She smiled, closing the folder. That patience, Mrs. Corbin, that's your strength. Remember, silence isn't weakness. It's evidence when kept. The words sank into me steady and cool like the spring water behind the cabin. For the first time since Paul's death, I felt something solid beneath my feet, not just land, but purpose. Rivera promised to handle the filings herself. You'll need to sign a few affidavits, she said. I'll send a courier up with the documents. You just keep doing what you're doing. Stay put, stay quiet, and keep records of everything, especially if she contacts you. I thanked her and stood. As she walked me to the door, I noticed a small framed photo on her wall, a gray-haired woman smiling beside a younger version of Maria. My abuela, she said when she saw me looking. She lost her house once. I made sure no one else's grandmother would. Outside, the air was brisk and clean. Owens waited by his truck hat in hand. How'd it go? She's good, I said, climbing in. And she believes me. He nodded, starting the engine. The road wound back toward the mountains, the late sun burning through the clouds. I held the folder on my lap the whole way home, its weight neither heavy nor light, just the shape of something finally beginning to turn in my favor. By late autumn, the leaves around the cabin had turned the color of rust and fire. The air was sharp enough to sting my lungs when I stepped outside, but the cold no longer frightened me. I'd begun to build small routines again, sweeping the porch, walking to Brevard twice a week, and helping Mrs. Patel with her store whenever her deliveries ran late. It was on one of those mornings that she called to me from behind the counter, a small white envelope in her hand. This came in with the postal drop, she said. It doesn't have a return address, but I think it's meant for you. My name, Evelyn Corbin, was written in uneven, looping handwriting that made my breath hitch. I recognized it before I even opened the flap. Go on, Mrs. Patel said softly. I'll mind the register. I stepped outside to the bench under the awning where the sunlight barely warmed the wood. My fingers trembled as I slid the letter open. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper folded twice. Dear Grandma, Mom says you're resting somewhere far away because you were tired and needed peace. I asked if we could visit, but she said no. She says it's better if you stay where you are. I miss you. I miss how your hands smelled like fabric softener and the way you'd hum when you sewed. Ryan still talks about the pancakes you made when we were little. Are you happy? Do you still think about us? I hope you do. I drew you a picture. It's me and you sitting on the porch with birds around us. Mom says I should stop asking about you, but I don't want to forget the sound of your laugh. Love, Emma. At the bottom of the page was a small crayon drawing two stick figures, one gray-haired, One with long brown pigtails, sitting on what must have been my old porch. A blue sky, a yellow sun, and a line of tiny red hearts floating between them. I pressed the paper to my chest and felt something give way inside me. The tears came fast and hot, surprising me with their force. I hadn't cried since the day Paul died, not when the house was sold, not when Claire left me at the cabin, not even when I realized everything I'd worked for had been taken. But this letter broke through the wall I didn't know I'd built. Mrs. Patel must have seen me through the window because she came outside and sat beside me without a word. After a while, she placed a warm hand on my back. "Letters like that," she said quietly, "they find their way for a reason." I nodded, unable to speak. The paper in my lap looked fragile, but it carried more truth than all the documents Claire had ever made me sign. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into my coat pocket. The world around me blurred with sunlight and tears. For the first time in years, the ache in my chest felt like something alive, something that could still reach across lies, across silence, across every mile my daughter had built between us. When I walked back toward the cabin that afternoon, the letter pressed against my heart. The path seemed less lonely. Somewhere beyond those mountains, a child still believed I was worth remembering. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin finding my way home again. The first call came on a Monday morning, just as I was washing the breakfast dishes. I didn't recognize the number, but something in me already knew who it was. I let it ring until the sound faded into silence. The second came an hour later. Then another. By noon, my old flip phone sat on the table vibrating in short, frantic bursts. Each time the same number flashed across the screen, the same pattern of urgency. That evening, I walked down to Mrs. Patel's store to help her stock shelves. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, and she glanced at me with concern. "Your phone's been ringing non-stop, dear." "You all right? I'm fine," I said, though the truth was that my stomach had been twisting all day. When I returned to the cabin, dusk was settling over the ridge. I placed the phone on the counter and stared at it. The screen glowed faintly, showing 18 missed calls. Then, as if sensing my hesitation, it began again. I pressed ignore, but they didn't stop. By the time I went to bed, there were 30. The next morning, 40. By the second afternoon, 45. On the 46th attempt, a voicemail came through. My hands shook as I pressed play. "Mom, please," Claire's voice burst through raw and trembling. "You have to call me back. Something's wrong. There's an investigation. They're saying the pension money, your money, wasn't properly transferred. I didn't know. David said it was fine. Mom, they're freezing the accounts. They're going to take everything. Please help me. I need you." Her voice cracked into sobs before the message cut off. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, the wind rattling the window panes. I should have felt anger or triumph, or at least relief. But what I felt was quiet so deep it pressed against my ribs. I thought of Paul, of how he'd warned me that compassion was both my gift and my flaw. "You forgive too fast, Eve," he used to say. "Someday someone will mistake that for permission." For months, I had wondered if I'd gone too far in the other direction, if turning away from my own daughter had made me something cold. But now, hearing her voice, I understood the difference between forgiveness and rescue. One is given freely. The other is demanded like debt. I sat down, closed my eyes, and listened again. The words no longer sounded like a daughter's cry. They sounded like the same control disguised as need, the same hand that once took everything I signed away. When the message ended, the phone beeped softly, waiting for me to decide. My thumb hovered over the keypad for a moment, then pressed delete. Outside, the wind carried the faint hum of the forest, the same rhythm that had become my comfort. I stepped out onto the porch, the air cold and clean, and watched as the last bit of daylight slipped behind the trees. Somewhere miles away, a phone would keep ringing in an empty room. But up here, the only sound was the mountain breathing steady and sure, as if it already knew justice had a way of finding its own voice. A few days after the last call, the quiet around the cabin began to feel heavier. Not frightening anymore, just dense, full of echoes. I tried to busy myself with chores, mending the torn curtain, sweeping the porch, drying herbs above the stove. But the wind that slipped through the cracks carried a restlessness I couldn't shake, like the house was holding its breath. That afternoon, as I moved the old rocker to clean beneath it, one of the floorboards creaked differently, hollow, not solid. I knelt, pressing my palm against the wood. It shifted slightly under my weight. Curious, I fetched a screwdriver from the drawer and pried it open. Beneath the dust, tucked between joists, was a small tin box, speckled with rust. For a moment, I just stared at it, half afraid it would crumble if I touched it. The lid was stiff, but it opened with a metallic sigh, as if exhaling after years of being sealed. Inside lay a stack of yellowed envelopes bound with twine, and on top of them a folded note in Paul's handwriting. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. His script was familiar, rounded, steady, a craftsman's letters. Eve, if they ever doubt your worth, remember you built this. Every board, every brick, every dollar came from your hands. The world will forget what a woman's work is worth unless she reminds them. This is your proof. Keep it safe. Love always, Paul. Beneath the note were our marriage certificate, a stack of savings bonds, and a few old receipts. Some were for building materials, others for sewing contracts, signed in my name. Each paper was faded, but every line tied back to me, to the hours I had spent stitching under a lamp, to the money that paid for the land where our first house stood. The bonds were still valid, their values printed in the same government typeface I remembered from the 60s. Together, they were worth more than I could have imagined, more than sentiment. This was documentation. Evidence. I sat back on the floor, the open box in my lap, and felt the strangest mix of grief and triumph. All these years I'd carried the memory of building our home beside him, but now I held proof that it hadn't just been love that sustained us. It was labor mine as much as his. As the fire dimmed in the hearth, I read his note again and whispered the words aloud. You built this. For so long, Claire's voice had replaced his, in my mind, cold, precise, convincing. But Paul's voice still lingered here, buried under the same floor where we once danced after painting the walls. I placed the note back inside the tin and held it close to my chest before returning the box to its place, sealing the floorboard carefully. Not to hide it again, but to let it rest where it belonged, under my feet, under my name, under my house. The mountain creaked softly around me, as if approving, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a visitor in my own life. The courthouse in Buncombe County smelled faintly of paper and rain. I sat on the wooden bench beside Ms. Rivera, my hands folded in my lap, the tin box tucked safely inside her briefcase. It was early morning sunlight cutting through the high windows like thin ribbons of gold. Claire sat across the aisle with her attorney, a man in a pinstripe suit who kept shuffling papers with trembling hands. She wouldn't look at me. Her hair was pinned back too tightly, her face pale under the fluorescent lights. For a fleeting second, I almost didn't recognize her. The girl who used to fall asleep on my lap after school had become someone small, defensive, and afraid. The judge entered, and the room rose to its feet. When we sat again, Ms. Rivera spoke first, her voice steady and sharp. She presented every document in careful order, the unfiled deed, the pension transfers, and finally, the power of attorney, with its unmistakable forged signature. She placed it before the court alongside an affidavit from the county registrar confirming the mismatch. The handwriting comparison leaves no question, Rivera said. This was not signed by Mrs. Corbin. Claire's lawyer stood to object, but faltered when the judge raised a hand. The man flipped through his notes, then stammered, We need time to verify." Rivera leaned forward. "You've had months. The verification is already on record." The silence that followed was heavy enough to fill the whole room. Claire's eyes darted to me for the first time, wide and pleading, but I didn't move. The judge reviewed the documents, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "This court recognizes the rightful ownership of the property in question to Mrs. Evelyn May Corbin. Furthermore, restitution will be ordered from the accounts identified as misappropriated. Ms. Claire Corbin is to undergo financial counseling and family therapy as a condition of settlement." Rivera touched my arm gently. "It's over," she whispered. But I stood and asked to speak. My voice sounded calm, even to me. "Your Honor, I said I don't need my daughter in prison. I just need her to stop spending what she didn't earn." The judge nodded once gravely. Claire lowered her head, her shoulders shaking. When the gavel struck, the sound echoed like a heartbeat through the chamber. Rivera began gathering the papers, but I stayed seated for a moment longer, watching Claire through the soft blur of tears. There was no triumph in it, only a quiet kind of peace, the kind that comes when the truth, at last, is allowed to stand on its own. The mountain had already begun to thaw by the time she came. The last traces of snow had melted into the stream, and the air smelled faintly of pine and wet earth. I was sitting on the porch, mending a torn curtain, when the sound of tires grinding against gravel reached my ears. For a moment, I thought it might be Mr. Owens bringing supplies, but the car that stopped at the foot of the path was far too polished, far too out of place among the trees. Claire stepped out still in her city clothes, heels sinking into the mud, hair unpinned, mascara streaked down her cheeks. She looked smaller than I remembered, her coat too large on her thin frame. She clutched her purse like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Mom," she said, voice breaking on the word. "Please, can I come in?" I didn't answer right away. I just watched her, the woman who had once been a child, tracing her fingers over the fabric on my sewing table, who now looked at me as if I were her last refuge. Finally, I nodded toward the porch chair. "Sit. The kettle's hot." She sat carefully, her shoulders shaking. I poured her a cup of tea and set it down between us. Her hands hovered over it, trembling before she spoke. "I'm losing everything," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The firm froze my accounts. David left. He said he can't handle the scrutiny. They're saying I'll have to sell the condo, the car, everything. I don't know where to go." I listened quietly the way I used to when my clients came to me with torn dresses and trembling voices, afraid of what could or couldn't be mended. She looked at me, then eyes wide desperate. "Help me, Mom. Please. I know I don't deserve it, but you're all I have left." I took a long breath, the steam from my own cup clouding the air between us. "When I offered you love," I said softly, "you wanted leverage. When I offered trust, you turned it into paperwork. I don't have anything left for you to take." She flinched, but I saw no anger, only exhaustion. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. "I just wanted control, not this." "Control is never enough," I replied. "You always reach for more until your hands are empty." Tears slipped down her cheeks. For a while, neither of us spoke. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the low creak of the pump handle outside. Finally, I stood and brought her a blanket. "You can stay for the night," I said, "but not because I forgive you, because I don't want you to freeze." She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. When she finally fell asleep on the couch, I stood in the doorway, watching her, this fragile stranger, wearing my daughter's face. I wanted to touch her hair to remember the child she had been, but my hands stayed at my sides. Outside, the forest whispered like it always did, before dawn, steady, patient, merciful in its own quiet way. I poured out the last of the tea and sat until the sun began to rise, unsure if what I felt was sorrow or something heavier, that love had finally learned to survive inside of. Spring returned to the mountains with a softness I hadn't felt in years. The snow melt fed the stream behind the cabin, and the air carried the faint sweetness of new grass. Life, it seemed, had decided to start over, and this time it was kind enough to let me do the same. When the settlement money cleared, I didn't feel triumph, only a steady calm. Ms. Rivera met me in town to finalize the paperwork. You could buy a bigger house, she suggested something closer to the city. I smiled and shook my head. This one fits me just fine, I said. But I'd like to make something that outlives me. That afternoon, we drafted a new document, a trust fund in Emma's name. Not an inheritance of land or resentment, but an education fund sealed under my care until she turned 18. The idea filled the small office with a quiet light. Rivera nodded approvingly. That's what legacy should look like, she said. But I wanted to do more. Brevard had been good to me when no one else had, and I had watched too many women come into Mrs. Patel's shop, asking for work that barely covered bread. So with Rivera's help and a small part of the settlement, I started a seamstress co-op, renting a corner of an old warehouse near the market. We began with 3 women, Ruth, a widow who hemmed uniforms for her grandchildren, Lila, a single mother who'd taught herself to sew curtains from YouTube videos, and Mrs. Patel herself, who insisted she wasn't too old to learn something new. We shared machines, patterns, and stories. The laughter that filled the room reminded me of my old sewing days of Paul, humming in the doorway of the hum of work that held a household together. Back at the cabin, I dusted off my old Singer. The motor coughed once, then purred to life. My fingers found the rhythm easily muscle memory stitched into time. The first thing I made wasn't for sale, it was a dress for Emma. Simple cotton pale blue with a hem she could grow into. I embroidered a small daisy on the pocket, just like the one I'd sewn on Claire's first school dress decades ago. When I finished, I folded it neatly and placed it in a box with a letter, for the girl who still believes in porch swings and laughter. Wear this when you remember where you come from. The co-op opened the following week, and the women came early, their chatter spilling out into the street. As I unlocked the door, the hum of sewing machines began to rise, a chorus of new beginnings, steady and strong. I thought then of all the things I'd lost, and how somehow what remained was enough to build something better. The mountain no longer felt like exile. It felt like proof that from the quietest corners, even the smallest hands could still shape the world. By summer, the cabin no longer looked like the place where I had been left. It looked like the place I had chosen. The roof was patched, the porch freshly painted a soft gray, and the garden out front bloomed in waves of lavender and marigold. Mr. Owens had built me new steps, solid and wide, and Mrs. Patel had insisted on planting tomatoes near the window. Every home needs something that grows, she'd said, handing me a tray of seedlings. The sewing co-op in Brevard had become more than work. It was a community. On Saturdays, the women brought their children, and we shared lunch under the open windows. Laughter filled the space between the hum of machines, and sometimes, when the light caught the dust motes just right, it felt like Paul was still there, hands folded, watching quietly from the doorway. One afternoon, I received a small package in the mail. Inside was a hand-drawn card and a photo Emma wearing the blue dress I had made, smiling wide sunlight, catching the embroidered daisy on her pocket. Beneath it, her careful handwriting read, "Grandma, it fits perfectly." I pinned the picture above my sewing table. It was the only photograph in the cabin, and I didn't need another. By late July, I had the last piece of the house, finished a wooden plaque by the door, carved by Mr. Owens, and painted by the co-op women. The letters were deep and steady. "The Corbin Home Dignity Lives Here." When they mounted it, the group clapped and whistled, but I only smiled, running my fingers across the wood. It wasn't grandeur, I felt it was recognition. For the first time in years, the name Corbin meant something honest again. As dusk settled, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea watching the woods shift from green to blue. The porch light I'd installed glowed gently above the door, its halo spreading across the steps. I had chosen a warm bulb on purpose, something that said, "Welcome," without asking anyone to come inside. The evening air was thick with the scent of pine and soil. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a whippoorwill called steady as breath. I closed my eyes and listened. Then the phone rang. It was a soft sound now, no longer sharp or demanding. I didn't check the screen. I already knew. It rang once, twice, and then I reached over and pressed the side button, silencing it. The forest resumed its quiet chorus as if nothing had dared interrupt. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled. The porch light glowed steady against the dark, and for the first time, I realized peace didn't always come as forgiveness or closure. Sometimes it came like this gentle, deliberate chosen. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive when the calls stop. It arrives when you stop answering. The woods around me sighed in rhythm, a lullaby older than grief itself. When silence finally feels warm, is it loneliness or freedom?